I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. If you ever want to watch a really beautiful but pretty disturbing movie, might I suggest Free Solo, which is available on Disney Plus. It is the story of Alex Honnold, who is the first person to free solo climb up El Cap without any rope support, failsafe at all. It's pretty harrowing watching him scale this rock face, knowing that at the slightest movement, he might well die. And it's a powerful story of his excellence, right? Like he wants to do this to prove, like he wants to climb this mountain with no support, just to prove that he can, to prove that he did it absolutely perfectly. And I mean, he's an exceptional person. The whole documentary is framed around this life that he lives, right? He lives out of his van, he eats vegan, he shuns so much of our like really hyper comfortable way of life. There's something very powerful in it. At the same time, whenever I watch it, I come away with this sense of just emptiness, right? I watch this guy doing this exceptional feat and living this exceptional life. And I always find myself thinking, like, is that greatness? Is that the greatness that we're called to aspire to? It feels wrong somehow. And that's not to take away from what he has accomplished, but to put it into a context. And I hear that in our gospel reading this morning, right? We are continuing this series through Mark, where we hear Jesus unpacking the idea of what greatness is and how we so often define it from our human perspective. And I want to lay out that within the context of our Christian life, greatness can never be something that we achieve as a solo activity. There is no such thing as competitive greatness, but any greatness that we are called to as in our Christian life, as modeled on the life and work and ministry of Christ, is rooted in a fundamental turn from ourselves to communion with God and communion with one another. So in our readings this morning, we have both this passage from Mark that I will come to in a minute, and we also have a story, a bit from the book of Hebrews that we have been reading through in the lectionary as well, in the context of the church. And Hebrews is maybe one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's an anonymous letter in the New Testament. It's not, in fact, written by Paul, although a lot of people think that Hebrews was written by Paul. And it's written by Jewish converts to Christianity, right? And, you know, as is always the case, we as Christians need to be incredibly careful of our reading of these texts. And it is the framing of Hebrews is really talking about the life and the ministry of Jesus. What did Jesus do? What does Jesus do for us? And talking about the self-offering and the sacrifice of Christ as bringing us truly into communion with God. And again, we need to be careful not reading this text as somehow supplementing the Jewish law or replacing or superseding the sacrificial system of the temple, but the anonymous writer of this letter, speaking to people from a Jewish context who would understand a resonance with the offering of Christ to the Jewish sacrificial system, and using that system as a way of illustrating what it is that Christ in his sacrifice does for us. And then there's this, in today's reading, what I want to focus on is this reference to the writer of the Hebrews telling Jesus that you will be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And it's this reference to one of the most random events in the book of Genesis. And it predates the Jewish covenant. It predates the Jewish sacrificial system. And it is a story of Abram before indeed God has renamed him Abraham, who has just fought this like weird war with some of these, you know, rival tribal communities. And he's for the sake of his nephew Lot, and these kings come to him after this victory. And in particular, this one king, Melchizedek, who is referred to as nothing more than a priest of the Most High God. who comes bringing offering of bread and wine. And it is never mentioned again. It is such a weird story. And I kind of love it because I love weird things. But I have to think that the author of Hebrews is invoking Melchizedek here because his audience would have known this story of Melchizedek bringing this offering of bread and wine and would see in that and understand that the author of Hebrews is fundamentally linking this to Jesus's own giving of his body and blood in the bread and wine of the Eucharist for us, and understanding Christ's sacrifice fundamentally as that self-offering, and self-offering not for its own sake, but self-offering that is given to us in the nourishment of the Eucharistic meal, and a meal that is meant to bring us into communion with God and communion with one another. It is about drawing us into the life of God. And that's important. And I think that helps frame what's going on in today's gospel reading, which picks up with James and John, two brothers, arguing with each other about wanting to sit at the right and left hand of Christ when he comes into his glory in heaven. And Jesus is like, do you get what you're asking for? And if you've been paying attention to these sermons for the last several weeks, you know, Jesus has been talking for several weeks about his coming death and about upending this whole notion of greatness and power, and calling us to see ourselves in the model of small, like vulnerable, weak children. And Jesus is like, are you still after this whole greatness idea after everything I've been saying to you? And James and John are like, no, we get it. We're here, we're in. And I feel like on some level they probably are. Maybe at this point, like maybe sometimes we don't give the disciples quite enough credit. And maybe they get it at this point, right? Maybe they've heard something about Jesus saying that he is about to suffer and die, and they are like, we can do this. We are in. And still Jesus is like, you don't get it, right? You're going to walk my path. And I think this is a reference to the fact that the disciples were Jesus's followers, were many of them martyred. You will walk this path, but that still doesn't equate to glory in the way that you are thinking of it. And then he goes on to unpack this whole idea of competitive greatness, right? That there is this idea of being the best, lording it over others. And I think we can wind up in this very twisted and strange place as Christians, right? Of a competitive suffering, almost, a sense that we can never enjoy anything, or if we like something, we can't trust our own feelings about it because we're meant to just suffer for the sake of suffering, and wanting to prove ourselves better than others, or prove ourselves enough for God by virtue of how miserable we are. And I think that plays into our lives in a lot of strange and complicated ways. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. And even if we are focused on making sure that we're not enjoying ourselves too much, or making sure that we are suffering for the sake of proving ourselves, we have missed the point of what Jesus's ministry is and what the life of the gospel that we are called into is. Because Jesus says, this isn't about proving yourself better than anyone else. This isn't about being the best, even if you're being the best at being the worst. This is about radically reorienting yourself to the people around you, to be last of all and servant of all. To turn away from fixation on ourself in whatever format that takes, and to be reoriented towards one another in really radical and transformative love. If we sit for a moment and really think about what that looks like, it would be a radically transformed world where we give of ourselves to one another and trust and open ourselves in vulnerability to those who seek to care about and serve us. I think about our tagline for the Diocese of Ohio: to love God, love our neighbor, change the world. And it's interesting to me to go back to that story of Alex Honnold and the Free Solo movie, right? Because I talk about how he, you know, it shows him being this exceptional person, not just in his rock climbing, but in the way he lives his life. Be again turning away from so much of what is our consumer culture here in, you know, the Western North American lifestyle, living with very, very, very little, living, not having a permanent home. And that feels aspirational, I think, at times. And yet it also separates him so much from the people around him. He, you know, the entire documentary is framed by a film crew who are afraid that they are going to have to watch their friend die in the making of this movie, and Alex himself doesn't seem to be able to actually enter into that fear with them. It cuts off his relationship with his girlfriend, as it's portrayed in the documentary. And I think about, you know, the fundamental theme of that movie is how absolutely perfect he has to be to make this climb. And the tiniest misplaced finger could mean his death. And I think about how precarious this idea of greatness that we so often hold to is, and how we hold ourselves so very often to standards that we were never meant to have. And that what God desires for us in our turn from ourselves to that real radical love of others is so much more than what is often presented to us, even as sacrifice and self denial in this world. We are called into love and communion and being, and the life giving nourishment that is offered to us week after week in the body and blood of Christ, that calls us not just into the life of God, but in communion with the people kneeling beside us at the altar. That's a radically, radically transformed way of being that we are invited to participate in. Thanks be to God.